We now know, though, that there are associations between Parkinson's and Alzheimer's with all kinds of lifestyle factors. So the idea that there's nothing to be done if you are at risk is a false premise. There is something to be done. And the idea that there's no benefit to early testing is also false, because the sooner you can know and make the appropriate lifestyle changes, the less likely it is that you develop the disease or longer in the future before it manifests.
Welcome to the Precision Medicine Made Simple podcast, where we simplify the complex world of precision medicine. We're here to explore how personalized healthcare can empower you to understand and improve your health to live a longer and healthier life. Join us as we break down the latest in medical science into actionable insights. Let's make precision medicine accessible and actionable for everyone. Enjoy the show. Today's episode is sponsored by Biography Health, where healthcare meets personalization. With their D-enabled blueprint, Biography Health empowers you with a health plan based on your unique DNA, aiming to prevent disease and extend your life. Take control of your health journey with a plan as unique as you. Visit biographyhealth.com and start your personalized healthcare journey today. As a reminder, this episode is for educational purposes only. This episode is in no way a replacement for professional health advice. Please consult with your professional primary care provider for medical advice. If at any point you feel that a topic discussed on our podcast was misrepresented, or if you have additional insights that could enhance our discussions, we wholeheartedly encourage you to reach out to us. Your feedback is invaluable in helping us improve and in ensuring our content remains both informative and reflective of the latest developments in precision medicine. In this episode, we're joined by Dr. Stanford and Taylor Cu to explore neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. It's a particularly personal discussion as Dr. Stanford shares his own genetic risk for Alzheimer's linked to the APOE4 gene. Dr. Stanford explains what neurodegenerative diseases are and dives into the specifics of Alzheimer's, including how genetics play a role in its risk. We wrap up the episode by looking at lifestyle changes that could make significant impact in prevention. Hey everyone, welcome to the Precision Medicine Made Simple podcast. I'm joined here with Dr. Stanford, and we are going to be talking about neurodegenerative diseases. Welcome back, Dr. Stanford.
Thank you. Good to see you, Taylor.
And so as a start off, just to kick off this episode, can we define neurodegenerative diseases then and the basics of what it is?
Yeah, it's pretty much what it sounds like. That is a dying off of critical neurons in different areas of the brain that leads to a variety of conditions. So there's one part of the brain that, or I'll say one part of the central nervous system that starts to atrophy, which starts to shrivel and pull back and die, almost like a plant dying. And it happens to be in the movement part of the brain that controls movement. And that's called Parkinson's. And that's a neurodegenerative disease. If that same process occurs in the temporal lobes, the lobes on the side of the brain, the hippocampus, the parts of the brain responsible for memory, we call that, it's often something called Alzheimer's dementia. Same with ALS and frontal temporal dementia. It is all essentially a dying off of neurons. And when it occurs in a certain area, the disease manifests in a particular way. Current thinking is that most neurodegenerative diseases are on a continuum of the same underlying process. And in some cases, some of the processes underlying Parkinson's are very similar to the processes underlying Alzheimer's, frontal temporal dementia, Lewy body disease, and the rest.
Process meaning
the cellular pathways that are going awry and how the neuron behaves as it is dying off, and how that portion of the brain has a certain amount of shrinkage, etc.
Oh, okay. And
so there's commonality between these different diseases in the degenerative process.
the degenerative process and the fact that then these neurons are dying and the location of where these neurons are dying is what determines the actual disease then. Am I understanding that correctly?
Perfect.
Wow.
Read, as they say in aviation, read back correct.
Okay. Perfect. Awesome. Okay. So I'm assuming then the most common ones are the ones that you mentioned then, Parkinson's, ALS, Alzheimer's, dementia. Those are the most common ones that that you see then.
Yeah.
Any others? Okay.
Although Alzheimer's is far and away the most common of all those and is becoming more and more common, Parkinson's is becoming more and more common, but on a scale of things doesn't begin to approach the frequency that we see Alzheimer's.
Okay, so let's dive into Alzheimer's then, because I want to explore how we are currently treating this, how we are currently screening for this, and what are some of the obstacles that we've been having with it.
Yeah, great questions. So the underlying disease process is one, again, similar to cardiac disease, heart disease, where the onset of it starts decades before we see the physical manifestation of the disease, before symptoms appear. We talked about with the heart, that fatty streak and atherosclerosis starts in the late teens to early 20s, certainly by the mid-20s. And similarly, with Alzheimer's disease, the process starts early in life, possibly as early as detectable changes in the brain that are not symptomatic as early as ages 35 or 40 for late onset Alzheimer's. The good news there, that turns out to be very good news, because if you can identify who is at risk, then that gives you a long runway to take actions to prevent the disease altogether or delay the onset of it. Because typically Alzheimer's appears at about age 65 years old, 65 to 70 years old. Now, what is the medical term is pathophysiology. So the better term is what goes wrong to lead to this disease process. The APOE Epsilon 4 allele that we talked about is certainly not the whole story. Amyloid, plaques, and tau fibrillary tangles are not the whole story either. You can have APOE4 Epsilon 4 and have a single allele, and there's still a 75% chance that you do not develop Alzheimer's. You can have two copies of the allele, and one copy from mom, one copy from dad, and still have a good chance of not developing the disease. So the APOE Epsilon 4 is not necessary to develop Alzheimer's dementia. And if you have those alleles or one of those alleles, it's not sufficient to cause you to develop Alzheimer's. So neither necessary nor sufficient. But the increased risk that those alleles bring to a person is certainly a clue as to the possible underlying mechanisms of the disease. Important to note that in the last year or two, we have learned a lot about what it is with the APOE Epsilon 4 that leads to an abnormal function in cholesterol transport, which has implications, and you can derive a scenario where that would lead to neurodegenerations. So there's been good progress there. There's also been a whole lot of research, literally billions of dollars of research over the last 10 or 20 years, looking at the role that the amyloid plaques and the tau proteins play in the disease process. So very important data points here, though. Just like APOE Epsilon 4 is neither necessary nor sufficient to cause the disease, neither is our amyloid plaques or the tau proteins that many of our listeners have heard of.
And so
there's been a lot of work done at targeting the amyloid plaque, trying to reduce it to see if there is any change in progression of the disease. And so far, those efforts have been not successful. Now, there has recently been a couple of medications approved by the FDA for treating early, late onset Alzheimer's, and there may be a marginal effect of with them, but the side effect profile on them is pretty awful, and of course the cost is exorbitant. But that's just first medications. There will be more.
So to make sure that I'm following then, and then also to catch up our listeners too. So I know we jumped into the APOE E4. So when we have two genes that we get from our parents, and they could either be E2, E3, or E4. So APOE E2, APOE E3, APOE E4. I don't know what E2 is. E3 is the neutral, but then E4 is the one that we think that it determines Alzheimer's. But then when you mentioned that there isn't a direct correlation between if you have it and you'll get it, it's just an increased risk if you have, let's say, APOE E4. The other two terms that I wanted to unpack as well is you mentioned amyloid beta and then tau proteins. Or you said amyloid plaques, the amyloid plaques that are within the brain.
You said that perfectly.
Okay, perfect. So what is the difference between the amyloid beta, the amyloid plaques, and then the tau proteins?
Yeah. Looking at an amyloid plaque under a microscope looks like somebody took, and even grossly looking at the brain, it looks like someone's spilled pudding inside the person's brain. So there's this accumulation of this sticky, nondescript substance that is in all the wrong places. The tau proteins form these things called neurofibrillary tangles that if you look at them under a microscope, it looks like a bunch of spaghetti. What both of them represent is a degenerative process underway. These are most likely the byproducts of the degenerative process, but they also most likely play a role in aggravating the degenerative process.
So in your example is that then, so the amyloid plaques is your pudding, and then the tau proteins is the spaghetti that you would see in the brain, and that could be a result of some form of disease that's I guess neurodegenerative disease then. Right?
They're both manifestations of neurodegeneration, and they both contribute in a positive feedback way at aggravating the progression of the disease. Again, there's plenty of people that have a ton of amyloid beta plaques and neurofibrillary tangles that have no dementia whatsoever. So again, but we see most frequently in people with dementia, we see those things, but we also sometimes see people that have all the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease that don't have those things. So it's a bit of a medical mystery. It's definitely probably one of the most complex of the horsemen. I think most people would agree the most complex and perplexing disease. And again, Big Pharma has spent tens of billions of dollars trying to get at what role these different phenomena play. The malfunctioning, misfolded APOE Epsilon 4? What is it about how that protein's usual function of transporting cholesterol around? How does that lead to this neurodegenerative process? Also, what role is the amyloid beta? Because again, it's neither necessary nor sufficient to lead to the disease, but there's a high correlation of it being present. And there's a lot of theories about why that is, but probably beyond the scope of what we're here to talk about today.
Yeah, and so then for my understanding, then okay, this is a loaded question then. How come we don't screen for this earlier on and wait for some form of symptoms to be able to screen it then?
We should screen early on. Historically, the medical profession has not screened early on for Alzheimer's because of the thinking there's really nothing we can do about it. The consensus opinion around most people that are trying to work in this medicine 3.0 personalized precision medicine space, that are looking to be proactive and preventive, we now appreciate that we probably should be testing these things early on. There is MRIs that you can do that will identify areas of these plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. The insurance reimbursement has been non-existent to cover that kind of thing in an asymptomatic patient. And again, if for no other reason, because the conventional thinking is there's nothing you can do about it. We now know, though, that there are associations between Parkinson's and Alzheimer's with all kinds of lifestyle factors. For example, blood sugar. So your brain is an organ that requires glucose and or ketones in order to be for its normal metabolism. If you are continually exposing your body to high levels of blood sugar spiking, you will become insulin resistant. Now, if you have the most important organ in your body and your brain is resistant to the very chemical insulin that will feed the brain glucose, that's not a good thing. We also know that anything that results in low blood flow to the brain, bad thing. Anything that results in low oxygen in the blood for the brain, bad thing. We know that anything neurotoxic like alcohol, bad thing. All these things I just mentioned are seen more frequently in people that have neurodegenerative disease. If you're diabetic, you're far more likely to develop neurodegenerative disease. If you have blood pressure out of control, you're more likely to develop neurodegenerative disease. And that's just a short list. So by looking at and having a sense and incorporating the brain's metabolic processes and realizing that that's an extension of metabolic processes in your body, that tells you a lot of what you need to know. So you were mentioning Dr. Attia before. Peter Attia in his book Outlive, they say what's good for the heart is good for the brain, and what's good for the liver and pancreas is good for the brain. So you want to get those metabolic pathways right, because when they're wrong, there's a much higher occurrence of neurodegenerative diseases, including all those that we mentioned before. So the idea that there's nothing to be done if you are at risk is a false premise. There is something to be done. And the idea that there's no benefit to early testing is also false, because the sooner you can know and make the appropriate lifestyle changes, the less likely it is that you develop the disease or longer in the future before it manifests. So would you rather manifest it at 85 than 75?
Wow.
If you're going to. And if for no other reason, treatments for Alzheimer's are likely to be coming fast and furious over the next decade.
Before we go into the progression of treatment in Alzheimer's, then have you, and because you mentioned that even though, let's say, they have an increased risk based on the amyloid plaque or tau proteins that they find, or they know that they have an increased risk based on the APOE4 within them, have you seen then these environmental risks or these environmental factors then make a difference into the reason why they don't have it? I know you can't necessarily have a direct correlation between the two, but I can imagine that if you are monitoring your blood pressure or monitoring your glucose that's coming into your body, like it gives you a better chance to then avoid Alzheimer's later on, even if you do have those.
You see, Taylor, you're a scientist at heart. So what you're asking for is what we call randomized controlled trial, an RCT. And that is, in fact, the gold standard for demonstrating cause and effect in the world of science and medicine. In the absence of that, because that kind of randomized controlled trial would be very difficult to do, although they are underway, make no doubt, and I'll tell a little anecdotal story. What my assertions and what others' assertions are relying on now are correlations between certain lifestyles and the prevalence of the disease in people that have that lifestyle. It's so prevalent and it's so logical. It's a pretty good bet that by modifying those lifestyle factors, it's hard not to be convinced that that is going to at least delay onset of the disease, if not prevent it altogether.
A thought that came into mind is the difference then between Alzheimer's and dementia. I hear that there's a difference between the two, and I guess they have two different names, so I feel like it should speak for itself. But I was wondering.
So I think I know the question you're asking. So let me take a stab at.
Okay, please, thank you.
Alzheimer's, dementia. There was a guy. His first name is a German physician. I think it was Alois or something like that, Alzheimer's. And he was the first person to observe that people with dementia, early onset dementia, he had a 55-year-old female patient that had autopsy that was known to have dementia, an aggressive form. He noted these amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles, and ultimately that particular disease got named after him. So one of the other things to point out here is there's two forms of Alzheimer's disease. There are at least two forms. There's early onset and late onset. So in a subset of people and they usually have the same they have this one particular genetic mutation that leads to this early onset dementia, and it can come in the 40s and 50s. That is the one that Dr. Alzheimer observed in this lady. It wound up being generalized then with the late onset Alzheimer's that is associated with the APOE Epsilon 4, which is a different gene from the early onset Alzheimer's. And now I think the most common interpretation is people with those amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. That's called Alzheimer's disease. What your question is, how is Alzheimer's dementia different from dementia? Dementia is the more general form of a loss in cognitive function. Alzheimer's dementia is a loss in cognitive function that's associated with these amyloid beta plaques and the neurofibrillary tangles associated with the tau proteins.
So with then,
but there's others, frontal temporal dementia, Lewy body dementia. There's also Parkinson's dementia. So Parkinson's disease usually, frequently, almost always, inevitably, usually, those patients will develop some degree of dementia as well. Which, again, the word dementia just means a
loss of cognitive function,
permanent, if you will, cognitive decline.
So there's a cognitive decline, and then there's different types of dementia then. And
one of the other common ones is something called vascular dementia, which is dementia that can occur because of a lot of little strokes. They call that multi-infarct dementia, where small clots form, are either thrown up into the brain from the heart, or they form spontaneously due to atherosclerosis in the small blood vessels in the brain, causing a lack of blood supply to a particular area. That can cause these very small but repeated strokes. Eventually you get enough of those and you'll have some cognitive decline. The other term for that is multi-infarct dementia. Some of our people listening will have heard that term.
And what blows my mind then is the fact that this is all intertwined then with, it sounds like, the environmental factors that we discussed in the cardiac disease episode can also impact and decrease our risk then for neurodegenerative diseases.
Right.
Then.
And when we talk about, I think in one of our future episodes, we're going to be talking about diabetes and inflammatory diseases.
Autoimmune.
Next week. Inflammation, bad for the blood vessels of the heart. Inflammation throughout the body, very bad for blood flow to the brain and other reasons. So inflammation in the body is not good for the heart or the brain. And there's a lot of commonality. So I would say that, to quote again, what's good for the heart is good for the brain, and what's good for the pancreas and the liver is good for the brain. So, one gets right at, blood supply and delivering oxygen and nutrients to the brain. The other is the ravages of having messed up metabolism in your body, the toll that takes on your brain. And very smart people. Another person to mention is Dr. Perlmutter and also Dr. Dale Bredesen. Those are both very astute neurologists that talk a lot about different things you can do to improve the blood flow to your brain, as does Dr. Attia in his book, There's a whole chapter devoted to how you can treat your brain a little better by treating your body a little better by focusing on these things like sleep, like blood sugar control, like blood pressure control. Don't smoke. Don't expose yourself to a lot of oxidative stress and inflammation. Keep those things quiet. Your brain likes it a lot. And even though there's not the randomized controlled trials for those things that you would like, there's definitely enough evidence out there about the association of things like high blood pressure and its adverse effects on the brain. A story I like to tell, and I think I have this right, so if there's physicians out there that are familiar with what I'm about to quote and I quote it wrong, I apologize in advance. But the way I remember it is that several years ago, there was a group in the UK that did a very large study from a cardiology standpoint. They were investigating whether people did better from a cardiac standpoint if they had a blood pressure of 140/90 or less, or 130/80 or less. they had to stop the trial prematurely because it would be unethical to continue having people in the control arm of 140 over 90. Did they have to stop the study because those people had more heart attacks and strokes? I mean, that may have been part of it, but the biggest part of it is they noted that those people had significantly more rapid cognitive decline. So they stopped the study and they said, no, everybody should be 130 over 80 or lower. And my understanding, and I can't quote the studies, but I want to say I've seen from reliable sources that the lower the blood pressure, the better. And short of having blood pressure so low that you become symptomatic and fall on your face and knock all your teeth out or whatever, we don't want that. But generally, you want your blood pressure to be as low as you can comfortably, safely tolerate.
So now moving this conversation then into some of the environmental factors that we can control. And I would love if, of course, if you're okay with it, I know we already spoke about it in the previous episode. You mentioned that you have APOE 4. And first off, I am curious, and of course, I guess if you're willing to share this too, we don't have to talk about this, but
let's be real. I think it's like 15% of us. Yeah. So it's not like a rare thing. 15% of us have at least one copy. And unfortunately, a small 2 or 3% of us have two copies. And it would be important for everyone to know their genetic status, to understand their risk, to see if they should be on the lookout for early signs of, the onset of late onset dementia. And again, there is a lot of literature out there that gets at exactly what you're talking about. For example, these neurofibrillary or the amyloid plaques can, with the right ophthalmologist looks in your eye, they can actually see those plaques in your retina, which is part of your central nervous system.
Whoa. You can see it in your eyes.
You can look at the retina sitting in the back of your eye, and there is imaging that can occur that will tell you if there's amyloid plaque there. And that could be the first indication you get that, you might be in trouble later on unless you do some things.
So what age did you get your genetics tested then? And then what age do you recommend people to then go and get their genetics tested just to see if they have it?
Well, because of that long runway and the decades long run up to these diseases manifesting and becoming symptomatic. For example, most people run into problems with heart disease in the most traditional sense, usually in their mid-50s to mid-60s. If you figure the disease started 30 years before that, then I would say by 25 or age 25 or 30, you would want to know if you're at risk for these things so you can start making the changes to make sure that those diseases never manifest in you.
So as early as possible.
The beauty of that's the personalization of many of you will have heard the term personalized medicine. And that is the process of looking at an individual's unique genetic makeup and biochemistry that can portend disease down the road. It's not as if those things are not knowable, they're knowable. And if you have a higher risk for a certain disease or condition, you're certainly going to want to focus and use that as motivation to, lead the healthiest lifestyle so you can live long into your 80s and 90s and be completely functional.
Is there an age where it's too young to get tested for something like this? Okay, dumb example, but let's say
great question. So the short answer is most people would tell you no. There's a big effort toward sequencing babies immediately at the time of birth so that if they start developing manifestations of some disease, there's no delay then in getting them treatment. In fact, friend of mine, Robert Green. Dr. Robert Green. He's the head of genetics and genomics at Harvard Medical School. He is in charge of the million baby. It's called, what do they call that thing? Baby-seq. He's in charge of sequencing 1 million babies prospectively at the time of birth and following the outcomes, whether that turned out to be helpful for those babies or not. So I think in the future, if I had a crystal ball, I'd say within 10 years, all babies will be sequenced at the time of birth.
Wow.
And when I see Dr. Green next, I'm going to ask him if he agrees with that estimate.
Yeah. We should even get Dr. Green on the podcast as well.
Oh my God. He's awesome. Nicest guy you'd ever meet and really a giant in this field of personalized precision medicine.
Mm. And then I could...
And and like Dr. Attia and Dr. Perlmutter, he's really a gifted communicator. He's great to listen to.
Oh, that's awesome. And so now moving forward with the environmental factors that we can control, and let's say you found that you have the neurofibrillary tangles inside of your brain, or the amyloid plaques in your brain, or you have two APOE4 alleles. What are some of the things that we can control? I know we already quickly spoke about it, but in summary, to then give our listeners.
Yeah. So the first thing you want to say to yourself is, I want to be in that 25% of people with 2 copies of the Epsilon 4 that does not get dementia. And I'm going to be very sure that that is a realistic possibility, as there's certain populations in parts of the world that have a whole lot of Epsilon 4 and no dementia whatsoever. So I would remind myself that that is not that Alzheimer's disease is not necessarily your destiny. What are the things you can do? I'm going to list them off, and I'm going to say first how I think of them, and see if I can remember the order that Dr. Attia listed. I would say blood sugar control. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, and I was also going to add on to your own personal experience too, and what you've done yourself, knowing that you have E4.
Yeah, I started getting on the blood sugar control before I knew about the APOE Epsilon 4, because I had family members that were diabetic and a father, brother, sister. So I wanted to make sure that never happened to me. And I got tested, and I wasn't pre-diabetic, but I wasn't, at the optimal levels of fasting blood sugar, etc. So I went on a low carb regimen. I got a continuous glucose monitor. I kept careful track of things. And I got my hemoglobin A1C down to about 4.9, my fasting glucose like 85, just like a teenager that eaten well their whole life. So diabetes is a disease that we know we can prevent and reverse. That's a fact. So that would definitely be a very important one. Exercise. Oh my gosh. So exercise is probably, and I'm going to quote, I'm going to have to attribute this to Dr. Attia again. You asked me about max VO2. So if you look at max VO2 and you call that a level of fitness, people that are in the lowest quartile, so to speak, if you're like in the 15th percentile, meaning 85% of people are more fit than you, compared to elite fit people in the top 5%, you're 5 times more likely to develop dementia, independent of your APOE status. So exercise, Chapter 9, I tell you, you read it and you'll realize that so much more of this is in your control. Similar things with blood sugar. Diabetics are a multiple, I don't mean a little bit more likely to develop dementia, are hugely more likely to develop we'll say twice as likely to develop dementia. Sleep is critical because we know that that's when the brain cleans itself. Yeah. And you want to get plenty of high quality sleep. Stress is also another thing that people that have extremely stressful lives are far more likely to develop dementia. I'm still working on that one. Sleep, I changed my, all my life. And the thing that is really sad, if you're a doctor, I can tell you that you spent considerable amounts of your life. I probably went 30 years where I had maybe 50 nights in 30 years that I got less than 2 hours of sleep at any one stretch. Now, how can that be? Well, I was in a very, arduous medical training program, and sleep was not respected back then. And I also was in solo private practice taking care of very sick patients. So I would get called 24 hours a day. So if I could turn the clock back, and if you had, one of these times you should interview my daughters, because I give them all the advice, so I say, whatever you do, make sure you get 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep. Don't ever get a profession where that's not the case. You're asking the other interventions I've done for myself for reduced alcohol consumption. I think you're going to see the medical community come out, powered by a lot of recent studies, that if you feel you're at increased risk for any kind of neurodegenerative disease, Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, you're going to want to minimize your alcohol intake. I wouldn't say that you have to eliminate it, but I certainly wouldn't do more than 1 or 2 servings once or twice a week. That's what I tell my patients now. Certainly, if you know you're at risk for a neurodegenerative disease, whatever theoretical cardiac benefit there is, it's certainly, in my mind, the threat to your brain health outweighs whatever possible benefit there would be to the heart health, because we know how to stop heart disease. There's medications, there's ways to stop the progression of atherosclerosis. And by the way, stopping the progression of atherosclerosis is another very important thing. Anything that improves the blood flow to the brain is going to be a good thing. Unless the thing that's improving it is a sky-high blood pressure, and you don't want that.
So
socialization, they've also found that social isolation, it has a high correlation with the onset of Alzheimer's disease. They've also found that things like hearing loss can make you at increased risk for Parkinson's disease. The thinking being that people that don't hear very well aren't engaged, which gets to another why I mentioned the social isolation. The other is learning new things, challenging your brain. And do I mean doing crossword puzzles every day? No, people that do crossword puzzles every day don't get less cognitive decline. They get very good at doing crossword puzzles. So, I mean, challenge yourself in ways where things like learning to play the guitar, learning a foreign language, really challenging your brain in ways it hasn't been challenged before. There's apps out there that can specifically challenge you in all the ways you need to be challenged to have that effect. I think the apps, there's an app I love called Elevate. They don't pay me, but I love that app. And you can do everything from improving the speed of your executive function, improving your memory, your math, your problem solving. It's about $30 or $40 a year for the app. I highly recommend that one.
So really, in summary, then it's anything that pumps your blood to the brain, and it's not just based on doing physical things, it's really taking also care of your mental health, making sure your stress is low, making sure you're getting enough sleep, making sure that you're also challenging your brain then too, and not just getting better at crossword puzzles, but
avoid social isolation, avoid stress. The number one thing that I think is the consensus you can do is exercise.
Exercise, because that relieves stress. And
I mean, purposeful exercise where you're improving your level of fitness and your oxygen carrying capability and your oxygen consumption capability, because that brain is one hungry. There's a reason why every animal on the planet doesn't have as big a brain as humans have, and that's because of the cost of the energy. The brain consumes like 25% of the energy of your body when you're at rest. When I'm sitting here right now, 25% of the calories I'm burning are in the brain. Your brain is a very hungry organ, and you need to have a high level of fitness to feed it, which brings me another thing. Hormone replacement, for example. They found that with women, there most likely is a benefit to perimenopausal estrogen replacement to decrease the chances of developing dementia. And speaking of women, a thing I failed to mention, there are risk factors for dementia, especially with the APOE Epsilon 4. It's far worse on women, far more likely for women to develop dementia that have the APOE Epsilon 4, also Caucasians.
Yeah.
So, for example, African Americans with APOE Epsilon 4, even though overall African Americans have more Alzheimer's dementia, they have less Alzheimer's dementia that's associated with the APOE Epsilon 4. And I was talking about parts of the world where there's almost zero Alzheimer's dementia. Nigeria, I believe it's Nigeria, has a very high prevalence of people with APOE Epsilon 4, no Alzheimer's dementia at all. So again, stressing, don't sweat the APOE Epsilon 4, but if you have it, you better be getting on your game ASAP.
And I think that's a great segue then to close out the show. So get on your game ASAP, pump that blood to the brain, exercise, get out there, de-stress, sleep, talk to people,
make sure you can hear, slap that continuous glucose monitor on and make sure you're not spiking and becoming insulin resistant. That's second to exercise is blood sugar control.
Well, and we're going to be diving into that in the next episode as well, because we're going to be talking about metabolic dysfunction and diabetes. So I'm excited to go through that and talking through insulin resistance. Cut down your alcohol, exercise, sleep.
Control your blood pressure.
Get after it. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you, Dr. Stanford, for all that insight. This is definitely one of my favorite episodes that we've done so far.
Thanks for joining us on the Precision Medicine Made Simple podcast. If this episode inspired you to learn more about your health, please leave us a review and share the podcast with a friend. Your feedback helps spread the word about the power of precision medicine. Remember, taking action today can lead to a healthier tomorrow. See you next time.